Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to present for NCEA's virtual conference. My name is Sandria Morton, and I am a faculty member with the Mary Ann Remick Leadership Program. The Remick Leadership Program prepares Catholic school leaders across the country through a 2-year graduate program where leaders earn a master's in educational leadership through the University of Notre Dame. I teach an executive management course as well as a course on improvement science for the program. Prior to my work with Remick and ACE, I was involved in supporting Catholic school inclusion through my work at Loyola University Chicago's Greeley Center. I've also been a Catholic school teacher and principal in the Archdiocese of Chicago. I absolutely love Catholic schools and have been honored to have worked with Catholic school leaders and teachers for my entire career. My doctoral studies were in curriculum and instruction, and I am deeply passionate about designing learning experiences that work for all learners, which is the focus of this session today. The session today is aligned with Standard 8 of the National Standards and Benchmarks for Effective Catholic Schools. This standard states, faculty use a variety of curriculum-based assessments aligned with learning outcomes and instructional practices to assess student learning, including formative, summative, authentic performance, and student self-assessment. So the objectives for this session are that participants will understand how the way assessments are designed can interfere with a student's ability to demonstrate their learning. The participants will be able to evaluate their own summative assessments and identify ways to improve them. And that as a result of this session, participants will be able to design authentic summative assessments aligned to the most important learning outcomes. It's very likely that this graphic is familiar to you. This framework, known as Understanding by Design, or Backwards Design, has driven curriculum development efforts for the past 20 plus years. With UBD, we begin by identifying the desired results. What is it that we want students to know, understand, and do? Then we determine the acceptable evidence of learning, or we design the assessment. Last, we plan the learning experiences and instruction that would sequentially build the knowledge and skill needed to show that mastery. Yet even though it has been around for so long, the reality is many teachers don't plan that way. There still seems to be an ingrained habit of planning the instruction, thinking about lessons day by day, and while you're doing that, to kind of simultaneously think about the outcomes, but not always as explicitly as you should. And then at the end of the unit, to reach for the assessment that comes with the textbook, or to stay up the night before the test writing it based on what you taught, or to dust off that old project description from last year and hand it out to the students. I know this because I did this. It is the way our curriculum materials are presented to us, and in fact, sometimes teachers feel as if they actually have to teach this way. I have to give the test in the book because that is the one given to me. But let's take a look at what those assessments that are created for us can look like. Take a look at this religion test. What problems do you notice? First, you might have noticed the word bank. Now, what happens when we have a test with a word bank? You can only use each word once, right? So if you get one wrong, then all of a sudden a lot of them don't work, and you get many of them wrong. Not because you don't know the answers, but because you're just trying to work with the answer choices that you have left and that you've been given. What else? Well, this test leaves me wondering, is this really the most important information from this religion lesson or this religion chapter? The students are asked to identify for the most part, right? Pretty low level learning. Is it really most important that a student can fill in the blank that God loves and cares for us? Or is it better if a student could come up with an example for how he or she knows God loves and cares for us? Now let's think about who this test might be particularly difficult for. How about the struggling reader? What about the student who has difficulty tracking? Won't it be difficult to be able to to find the word needed and cross it off and place it on the right line? Or what about the student with reading comprehension challenges? Which really, this assessment is assessing more reading comprehension than the religion content. That religion book came straight from the textbook. So the problem is not actually with the student, but instead it's with the curriculum. Our resources, our textbooks are designed for the average students. And that means that our textbooks or our curriculum has the disabilities. They present the content in one way, usually through reading, and they ask students to demonstrate their learning in one way, usually a publisher-created test. There is no mandate that teachers must use the test in the book. In fact, it so often presents unfair barriers to students. So teachers must see themselves as the designers of the curriculum. They must design assessments that will work for all students. In order to design these accessible assessments, it's helpful to think about universal design for learning. So what is UDL? Well, in this presentation, we're just going to scratch the surface of UDL. But if you don't know much about it, I would highly recommend doing some research and reading, as this approach to teaching and learning can be a game changer for serving students in your classroom, all the students in your classroom, all who learn differently from one another. So what is universal design? Universal design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, without the need for adaptation or specialized design. This universal design began in architecture. The automatic door and the curb cut are examples of universal design. How can we change the design so that it works better, not only for the person with the disability, but for all of us? So the curb cut, not only does that work for the person using a wheelchair, but it also works for the parent pushing a stroller. How can we think about teaching and learning in the same way? UDL asks that we design curriculum so that students have multiple means of accessing the learning and expressing their understanding. This means that students should have multiple ways to engage with the content through stimulating their interest and establishing relevance of the learning. This means that the content should be presented in multiple ways. So maybe through reading, but also through a video, or listening, or visuals. It also means that students should be able to demonstrate their learning in multiple ways. So not only through a written test, but maybe through speaking, creating. Why is it so important to consider universally designed assessments? Well, because summative assessments are gatekeepers. Oftentimes, summative assessments make up the largest portion of students' grades. These grades dictate whether students can proceed to the next level of schooling, what high schools and colleges they attend. They impact how students feel about themselves as learners and how they feel about school. So it is our responsibility for assessments to measure what students truly understand, can do, and know, without unfair disadvantages. Further, we need to realize that UDL, meaning offering students choice and multiple representations, is a must-have, not a nice-to-have. It's essential to providing equitable learning for all students. This is an equity issue, and as you can see from this quote from an article in Harvard's Usable Knowledge publication, there needs to be a realization that elements like choice, options, multiple representations are literally what keeps some communities from accessing and participating. These aren't nice-to-haves. For some people, they're absolutely necessary. This article further states that equitable and inclusive learning environments are those that are intentionally designed. Educators should feel empowered to think of themselves not just as instructors or leaders, but as designers who are building and iterating classrooms in which all students can succeed. So how can we be designers of equitable assessments? Let's get some practice with another example. This test was given after a life cycle unit in October in a first grade classroom. So like the religion test, this offers some barriers. First, many of the students in first grade probably couldn't read yet, so this presents a barrier, whether it's reading the directions or being able to read those important vocabulary words. Second, not only do they have to copy the correct word on the correct line, but they also have to number the stages, which is counterintuitive in the way that this test is designed, because naturally you would number from top to bottom, left to right. So that would mean that you would sort of naturally number the butterfly number 1, which we know would be incorrect. Further, just like the other test, if you get one wrong on this test, you get most of them wrong. So how could you make this more universally designed? Maybe you could just have the students cut out photos of the stages and then order them and glue them. This would be more straightforward. They'd need to know the vocabulary, and they'd need to understand which stage followed which stage. But you could have them actually tell you the name of each stage rather than have to identify the correct word. Also, you'd want to think what really matters about this learning. You really want the students to understand that organisms grow and change through a predicted life cycle. So maybe you'd want them to describe those changes, and that would be even more revealing. Or maybe you'd want them to compare the life cycle of a butterfly to another animal or a plant's life cycle. And them explaining that to you could be a much better way to understand what they truly understand as a learner. So you start by identifying the desired results, what really matters. This might mean starting with a standard. So let's look at this example for third grade. The standard is to describe characters in a story, for example, their traits, motivations, or feelings, and explain how their actions contribute to the sequence of events. Then let's look at this assessment. Students are asked to match characters, and they're asked to order events in the story. There are obvious flaws in the test design, which we've already discussed, but we can also see that this is not actually aligned to the standard. Yes, it has to do with characters, and it also has to do with sequencing, but it does not have to do with the relationship between the characters and their traits and the sequence of events in the story. And that's what really matters about this standard. What if it instead looked like this? Students are given a graphic organizer to help think about Wilbur's feelings and personality traits and behaviors, and then asked to determine how those led to the specific events in the story. Or even better, what if this was done at school with the teacher's support as a guided practice for how to make these connections using that shared reading that the class did of Charlotte's Web? And then after practicing this with a few characters from Charlotte's Web, for the assessment, the students are now read a new story, and they're asked to apply the same skill to a novel situation. Won't this be a better assessment of what really matters about this standard? So now, what about the students for whom this presents a barrier? First, I would suggest that the teacher read the story aloud, because you're not trying to assess whether or not the student can read fluently, but instead whether they understand how to draw those connections. Second, what if the students have the option of writing the response or recording it into an iPad? This would take care of the students for whom writing it would be either a physical barrier or just a barrier in skill. Or what if students were given specific sentence starters if they would struggle with the writing aspect? Again, what you want to get to is really understanding if they can draw the connection between the personality traits and the feelings of a character and the actions and events of a story. And you don't want anything to interfere with your ability to understand if the students can do that. So when we consider that first step of UBD, of identifying the desired results, it could include knowledge. It could include important facts or principles, which are very often assessed through tests or quizzes. And it could also include procedural knowledge, or what we call skills. And it depends on the skills, but this is very often demonstrated through solving a problem, through drawing, through writing. The desired results could also be forming specific dispositions in students. So maybe you're seeking to develop a personal faith life in your students. So this could be evidenced through personal reflections or self-assessments or a portfolio of prayer experiences. But we also need to remember that more than knowledge and skills and even dispositions, we seek to develop student understanding. They need to be able to make meaning from the facts and to connect them and to take multiple perspectives, to empathize, to connect, to interpret. This is why it's so important that as designers of units, of assessments, we approach a unit thinking, what really matters? When I think about the next 6 weeks that we're going to spend on this topic, what do I hope my students will leave with? Is it a list of dates and important names and vocabulary words? Probably not. Instead, you likely want them to bring that information together and to be able to really express their true understanding of something much more important, something that will last and stick with them for years to come. So let's take the Revolutionary War. Certainly, this is a topic in elementary and high schools at some point. It's limiting to think about what you want them to only know about the Revolutionary War. Yes, they might need to know some names and dates and sequence of events. But more than that, what do you want them to understand about the Revolutionary War? This takes some deep thought on the part of teachers, and you would probably identify some pretty important concepts, like the social, economic, and political factors that lead to revolution, or the power dynamics at play in revolution, making connections to revolutions in the present day or at other points of history. Maybe you'd want them to understand how people justify their actions based on ideals or principles. This is where it gets exciting, and this is what leads to lasting learning. So now that we've landed on the essential understanding, it's time to design the summative assessment that will match that. We want to think about authentic assessments, which mirror the real thing. So here's an example, borrowed from the Louisiana Department of Education. And for this assessment, we're thinking about that enduring understanding of people justify their actions based on ideals or principles. This would be the understanding that teachers have identified as the outcome of this unit. They want their students to leave not only knowing facts about the Revolutionary War, but really understanding this concept that people justify their actions based on ideals or principles. So how would you assess that? So in this example, students are given a side as a patriot or a loyalist, and they're asked to investigate the stance on several issues from that perspective. This asks the students to research, so you're forming research skills. It asks them to consider first-hand accounts, primary documents. It asks them to make meaning from important quotations. Ultimately, they need to be able to express their point of view with supporting evidence. They need to engage in a debate, and for preparation for that debate, prepare a list of questions. So you can see that this particular assessment could be accessible to all students. Naturally, some students would need specific supports to be able to access this assessment, but certainly their interest is piqued. Certainly there's levels of choice and ways to take multiple perspectives in approaching this assessment, different from a more traditional test. Let's take a look at another sample of an authentic assessment. In this one, it says, you are a zoologist who's charged with creating a habitat for a new animal that's coming to the zoo for the first time. You need to be sure the animal can survive throughout their life in this habitat. Choose any animal and describe how the animal changes through their lifespan. Through a presentation, share pictures of each stage and present the physical changes. Also explain how the basic needs change throughout the stages of life and how you will provide it in the habitat to help the animal with healthy development. As an extension, include an explanation of the vegetation in the habitat and how the plant traits also may be affected by environmental factors. So what makes this assessment accessible to all students? Well, they have a choice of what animal they can choose. They have time. They're not bound by time constraints of a test or a class period in order to demonstrate what they know. They have the time that they need to be able to do the research, put the information together, and really form that understanding. They have the opportunity for preparation. They can rehearse their presentation. They can ask for support along the way that they need. What other accommodations could you offer that would not alter the demonstration of essential learning? Well, for the student who might exhibit anxiety presenting, you could give them the option of recording their presentation ahead of time and planning it and playing it for the class, or maybe presenting it to you privately. You could also consider how they might be able to express this understanding through writing or through a visual display with writing. While it was alluded to before, I just want to point out that when you're designing assessments, it's essential to audit for what other non-content area skills might be affecting the student performance. So if all social studies assessments require students to read and write on grade level, and you know that you have students in your classroom who don't read or write on grade level, then you know that their social studies grades will be unfairly affected by that challenge. And you'll never know their true ability or understanding of social studies. So this example here, the final assessment requires students to interpret a primary source document from the Revolutionary War and write a 200-word essay describing the point of view of the author of the letter and describing the events that may have led to his current position. We obviously can see here how writing is going to, and even reading, is going to affect the student's ability to demonstrate their understanding. So we can think about having an audio recording ready of that primary source document. We can think about allowing a student to use speech to text for their essay, or to submit their essay as a video response. Again, you would still capture that main learning that is connected to social studies. Finally, I want to present the idea that any assessment that you create, any universally designed assessment, needs to be an assessment of learning, but also an assessment for learning. And when we talk about an assessment for learning, it's an assessment for learning for the student and also for the teacher. So it should inspire action. Therefore, a simple letter grade is never enough. Assessments should be graded with a rubric or a proficiency scale. Let's take a look at this rubric. Aside from entering this into your grade book, what else would this feedback inspire you to do? Well, it gives you clear feedback on areas that a student needs more support in. So maybe if you had a large portion of your students who you noticed needed more support in how to state the main idea and supporting details, you would reteach that to the class. Or if it was a small number, you'd provide interventions to those students. Or this could inspire you to change your unit for next year, providing more practice opportunities ahead of the assessment, or changing the way in which you taught it. Or this might actually demonstrate to you that the assessment was flawed and that you need to revise that for next year. All that to say, we could not have had the same response if we simply gave a grade on that essay response. Our early childhood educators do this very well. Take a look at these writing samples from December and February. For sure, we could not find an early childhood teacher that would give a letter grade, like a C- for the first one, and a B+ on the second, and then average that for a C+ report card grade. No, instead, they would provide specific feedback. Maybe they'd label the first writing sample as beginning and the second as developing. And they would report the most recent level of achievement on a report card. So in this case, developing. And that would compel us to act. That would tell the parent that continued practice of the skill would benefit the student. And it would tell the teacher that as well. So as we wrap up this session, let's take a look at a checklist of considerations when designing universally designed assessments. You want to consider, first, is the assessment aligned to the learning goals and standards of the unit? And taking that a bit further, does the assessment rely primarily on knowledge, like memorization, or does it actually assess understanding? You also want to look at the format and visual complexity of the assessment and see if that presents any limitations. Is the font large enough? Is there enough space between each question? Are the directions clear and direct and presented before any test items? Are the images, charts, and graphs on the same page as the questions that they relate to? Do any of the questions extend over 2 pages? You also want to think, does the assessment offer flexibility? Are there choices provided? Are there multiple means of expression allowed? Can a student write or record or draw or present? Is there a choice of prompts? Can they utilize graphic organizers? And you also want to consider, is the assessment written in a manner that allows me to provide useful feedback to my students beyond a letter grade? Will the data I gather from this assessment inform curriculum planning and the supports that you can provide to your students? Thank you for watching this presentation. If I can support you in any of the very good work that you're doing in our Catholic schools, please don't hesitate to reach out.